Part 1. Dictator. 1. Psychological warfare. I was loyal and fearless. I didn't have to live in terror of the consequences of being late for work. Nor did I need to keep my head down like other cadres in an attempt to be invisible at party meetings for fear of becoming the next target of criticism. I had immunity, thanks to dear leader, who had sanctified me after being moved by a poem I wrote in his honor. The world might damn North Korea as a ruthless regime that kills its own people, claiming that the system is oppressive and run by physical force. But this is only a partial view of how the country is governed. Throughout his life, Kim Jong-il stressed, "I rule through music and literature." Despite being the Commander-in-Chief of the Democratic People's Republic of Korea, DPRK, and chair of the National Defense Commission, he had no military experience. In fact, he began his career as a creative professional, and his preparation for his succession to power began with his work for the party's Propaganda and Agitation Department, PAD. To express this in the language of dictatorship, understood by the outside world, Kim Jong-il wielded a double-edged sword. Yes, he was a dictator by means of physical control, but he was also a dictator in a more subtle and pervasive sense, through his absolute power over the cultural identity of his people. In a mode characteristic of socialism, where ideology is more important than material goods, he monopolized the media and the arts as a crucial part of his ambit of absolute power. This is why every single writer in North Korea produces works according to a chain of command that begins with the Writers' Union Central Committee of the party's Propaganda and Agitation Department. Anyone who composes a work that has not been assigned to the writer through this chain of command is by definition guilty of treason. All written works in North Korea must be initiated in response to a specific request from the Workers' Party. Once the writer has handed in his piece, it must then be legally approved before being accepted as a new work. Those writers who produce distinguished works under these standards are of course rewarded. The role of a North Korean writer, in each set task, is to create the best articulation of the assigned idea according to a combination of aesthetic requirements determined in advance and in consultation with the Workers' Party. It is not the job of a writer to articulate new ideas, or to experiment with aesthetics on his or her own whim. Literature thus plays a central role not only in North Korean arts, but also in the social structure of the country. Before 1994, when Supreme Leader Kim Il-sung was alive, the art of the novel was preeminently in vogue. Nearly all the top state honors, such as the Kim Il-sung Medal, the Order of Heroic Effort, and the title of Kim Il-sung Associate, were swept up by the state's novelists. The novel provided a perfect narrative format through which writers might expound upon the great deeds of the Supreme Leader. It also helped that in his last years, Kim Il-sung lived immersed in the world of novels. He took a special interest in works written by novelists belonging to the April 15 Literary Group, a first-class literary institution whose remit is the revolutionary history of Kim Il-sung and Kim Jong-il. As is the case with first-class train stations, the term first class is incorporated into the job title of the nation's professionals who work only on matters directly related to the Kim family. In fact, Kim Il-sung's own memoir, With the Century, was compiled by a group of first-class novelists from the April 15 Literary Group. In elite circles, the memoir was known as one of Kim Il-sung's favorite books. Once, at a gathering of North Korean cadres who had family connections in Japan, Kim Il-sung described, to the amusement of his guests, how much he enjoyed reading With the Century. After his death, and as his son Kim Jong-il's rule became established in the institutions of the state, the status of novelists changed. Poetry became the literary vogue. This was not due solely to Kim Jong-il's preference for the form. The phenomenon was reinforced, if not triggered, by a shortage of paper when the North Korean economy collapsed, and people scrabbled just to survive. When there wasn't even enough paper in the country to print school textbooks, not many people could afford to own a hefty revolutionary novel. With poetry, however, the necessary tenets of loyalty to the Kim dynasty could be distilled potently into a single newspaper page. This is why poetry emerged as a dominant literary vehicle through which Kim Jong-il exercised his cultural dictatorship. With a decrease in the number of novelists and an increase in demand for poetry and poets, a more stringent professional hierarchy was needed. Epic poets write long poems. Lyric poets write shorter ones, and this generic distinction came to determine a poet's rank. Although the Workers' Party alone could decree which genre a poet might adopt, and which poets might be permitted the honor of praising Kim Jong-il through poetry. The epic genre of Kim Jong-il poetry in particular was restricted to just 6 poets, who were also the Poets Laureate of North Korea. At the age of 28, in 1999, I became the youngest of this tiny elite of court poets. Based on age and experience alone, I had accomplished the impossible. Unlike my fellow poets, however, I was also an employee of the United Front Department, a job that allowed me entry into a world completely unknown to most ordinary North Koreans, where I was given access not only to state secrets, but to a world that lay far beyond the remit of the Workers' Party. The United Front Department, UFD, is a key section in the Workers' Party, responsible for inter-Korean espionage, policy-making, and diplomacy. Since 1953, Korea has been divided by an armistice line, known as the Korean Demilitarized Zone, DMZ, held in place by military force on each side. The division of the Korean Peninsula is not based on a difference in language, religion, or ethnicity, but on a difference in political ideology. The North Korean version of socialism, founded as it is on the maintenance of absolute institutional unity, regards pluralism and individual determination as its greatest enemy. The Workers' Party has therefore been active and diligent in psychological warfare operations aimed at Koreans in both the North and the South for over half a century. Entrusted to this most sanctified mission, I worked in Section 5, Literature, Division 19, Poetry, of Office 101. In spite of the uncanny and unintended echo of Orwell's Room 101, this office was, ironically, so named precisely in order to avoid any hint of the nature of our work. The institution had been established in 1970, and the ratification from Kim Il-sung had been issued on the 10th of October, hence Office 101. When it was first set up, my department specialized in conducting psychological warfare operations against and in relation to the South through cultural media such as the press, literary arts, music and film. After the 1970s, it strove particularly to amplify anti-American sentiment and foster pro-North tendencies among the South Korean population, exploiting the democratic resistance movements that had arisen against the then military dictatorship. Work produced here was circulated under the names of South Korean publishers, and even took on their distinctive literary style, preferred fonts, and quality and weight of paper. In music, too, the styles of instrumental and vocal arrangements were copied from South Korean recordings. Books and cassettes produced in this way were systematically distributed by our department through pro-North organizations in Japan or through other Southeast Asian nations, and passed on to democratic resistance movements in South Korea. My department in this way sowed the seeds of what might at first appear to be a political paradox. Even today, sympathy towards the DPRK among South Koreans is almost entirely concentrated within the democratic, progressive, and anti-authoritarian camp of the nation's political divide. Just as on a beach, wearing a swimsuit is more appropriate than a business suit, in the spirit of being faithful to the South Korean context, the institutional slogan of the UFD was localization, whereby we were required to absorb the character and identity of South Koreans. My first day at work in Office 101 and therefore my entry into its South Korean bubble, was 12th of August 1998. I was 27. I was never more proud of myself than that day, as I stepped into the secret world of the UFD. My office was in the built-up neighborhoods of Ronghwa district in Pyongyang's central area. The strikingly different world of Office 101 was evident as soon as I crossed the threshold of the compound. There was a large steel gate with high walls all around, representing the exclusivity of a world that ordinary people could not peer into. Employees used a small entrance that was part of the gate, and which allowed only one man at a time to squeeze through. A single soldier stood guard. The presence of the soldier was also a mark that distinguished this institution from the rest of North Korean society, where employees usually took turns to serve as guard and surveillance for and against fellow employees. As if to confirm that guard duty was a separate duty from UFD duties in this institution, a male cadre of our department's party committee had to be fetched to explain my presence to the guard, and to have my identification double-checked before I was allowed to set foot in the compound for the first time. Once I entered, in contrast to the small and unassuming entrance, the yard was very large. Everything was paved with cement, without a trace of visible bare earth. The cadre who came to fetch me explained that the 4-story building opposite us was the headquarters of Office 101. The main building was flanked to the left by a library of South Korean literature and an assembly hall. Communications Office 813, to the right, was where counterfeit books were printed under the imprints of South Korean publishers. Pointing to the library, the cadre told me that the library building had been the only school for courtesans in Pyongyang at the time of the Japanese occupation. Adding that Wolyangdong, in Morangbong area, not far from here, was a famous courtesan area in the past, he smiled knowingly at me. My office in Division 19, Poetry, was on the 2nd floor of the main building, and in my time there were 8 of us in the team, 7 men and 1 woman. Opening the office door, I immediately saw long wooden desks on 2 sides of the room. Each desk sat 4, and we would face the wall as we worked. As I set foot on the marble floor of the office, I almost turned back to leave. It was as if I had just blundered onto the scene of North Korea's most terrifying crime, treason, the extent of which no one else in the country could begin to imagine or exaggerate. The forbidden materials so casually littering every surface in the room would have brought a death sentence in any other room in all of North Korea, and, anywhere else in the country, the shocking slogan framed in pride of place on the wall would have been far beyond the pale in its daring contradiction of half a century's demonizing of the South. The enemy newspapers and books strewn carelessly about the office were only slightly less astonishing to my eyes than the mandate for Office 101 from Kim Jong-il, respectfully framed and displayed prominently on the otherwise bare white wall. Inhabit Seoul, although you are in Pyongyang. An act of abominable treason outside these walls was not only permitted within them, but actively encouraged by Kim Jong-il himself. The leader required us to inhabit South Korea's collective psyche so as to undermine and triumph over it. Every day I worked in the UFD, I never lost my sense of wonder at our world's stark and secret contrast with the closed society outside our compound. With our Workers' Party passes in our shirt pockets, we arrived at Office 101 every day at 8 a.m. and began our working day by reading the South Korean newspapers. Although North Korea's official name is the Democratic People's Republic of Chosun, it refers to itself as Chosun, and South Korea as Southern Chosun, and defines the borders of Korea from the DPRK point of view. However, in the course of our work in Office 101, we saw the term South Korea everywhere in the papers, and it became second nature to us. In North Korea, the Southern administration was portrayed as a treasonous regime led by a sycophantic leader, who continued to betray the Korean people and their land in order to make them puppets of the United States. But through the media that filled the room, we came to know their leader as the South Korean president. As no one within our office was allowed to talk about their job, or to know anything about her colleagues, there were no items on anyone's desk that were not strictly necessary to the task at hand, apart from the calendar. The only item that stood out in the room was a small mirror on the table of our female colleague, fiercely marking her territory as a woman. If it weren't for the different locks on each of our desk drawers, the rest of us might forget which desk was our own. Just as our drawers were always locked, members of my team rarely talked about their personal lives, although there were only the 8 of us. Once, I cautiously asked the reason for this on my way home with a senior acquaintance at the UFD. His answer was unexpected. He said the reason why everyone kept to themselves inside the office compound was not so much because of security constraints, but because of the nature of our work. Outside, we were Pyongyang residents and North Koreans. Inside, however, we were South Korean citizens, each one of us. As there was not much to talk about while in these foreign shoes, the lack of conversation on personal topics had become an institutional habit. After this explanation, I understood better how the essence of localization was our chameleon-like duality. Nevertheless, this privileged localization was strictly controlled. South Korean newspapers were only loaned out for a day at a time, and we had to return them to the library before leaving work. In the case of South Korean novels or poems, we could borrow them for several days, but we had to keep them in our locked drawers when leaving the UFD premises. Taking any South Korean materials out of this area was forbidden, and the librarian sometimes visited the office unannounced to check that our reading materials were kept securely. Our main task, from the moment we arrived at work to the moment we left, was to transform ourselves into South Korean poets and write South Korean poetry. To be more precise, we were to be South Korean poets who were supporters of Kim Jong-il. My South Korean pseudonym was Kim Kyung-min. Our names and surnames had to be different from our real names, and when asked to choose a pseudonym, I had used the name of the first relative who came to mind. Supervisor Park Chul deliberated for over 3 hours on whether the name sounded plausible as that of a South Korean poet, before he granted permission for me to assume it. In return for our specialist work, and on top of our standard rations, we received additional rations of imported food every Saturday. Because of our identity as inhabitants of the outside world, the resources we received, different each time, came from the outside world. They were taken from humanitarian materials donated by the United Nations and the rest of the international community, as well as from South Korean NGOs and religious organizations. In the 5-kilo packages that we received, there would be rice from the US, cheese, butter, olive oil, mayonnaise, and even underwear and socks. Sometimes there were cookies and sweets, or milk powder intended for babies. Because we were given so much, it was a chore to collect our regular rations from the public distribution system, on which the rest of North Korea depended on for survival. The foreign packages always came to us with their labels intact. The existence of such international aid was viewed as a shameful secret that the regime could not afford to reveal to its ordinary citizens at a time of widespread famine, as it would undermine the state's ideology of self-reliance. But as our department's role was to live and work as outsiders, it seemed logical that we should receive outside goods. We had been hand-picked for this work, and were trusted not to be tarnished by association with these outside voices and supplies. It felt like a blessing to be allowed to inhabit such a privileged world. Consuming outside products was easy, but thinking like an outsider was not. One day, feeling it was too difficult to write successfully like a South Korean, I consulted Supervisor Park Chul. He was a man who struck me as imposing, despite his balding head. He had double eyelids and thick eyebrows that bristled with charisma. "I don't really know much about Southern Chosun," I said, "and I just don't have the knowledge or experience to make literature out of Southern Chosun life. So exactly what kind of writing should I do here?" Supervisor Park Chul laughed so hard that his comb-over flopped down over his eyebrows. He patted it back into place. "Neither you nor I have been to Seoul," he said. "Although we're all countrymen, northerners and southerners, Our cultures are different now, but it doesn't make much difference, because we're actually working with the northern audience in mind, not the people of southern Chosun. He paused to crumble some cooked egg yolk into a fish tank containing 3 bright red fish. After tipping the rest of the egg yolk into his mouth, he wiped his hands and continued. To succeed here, you have to give up on anything like your own name or renown as a writer. You know, when I used to work for the Writers' Union, I was a star on the rise. You've probably read my poems. Take, for example, Longing for My Townsfolk. Yes, I replied, though the title didn't ring any bells. He continued, If I'd stuck to being a poet, I'd probably be a household name by now. But since I've spent my life as a UFD operative, no Koreans here or in the South will ever recognize my work. Still, at least we have an easy life, working here. Hearing him sigh, I thought of him as a lonely, aging man who had to keep his secret life to himself and his colleagues. Just as he said, working at the UFD meant not only hiding our work from our countrymen in the South, but also from those in the North. With the increasing economic discrepancy between the North and South, the ideological warfare against the South was perceived as futile by the 1990s, and the propaganda campaigns against the South had run out of steam. By my time, the UFD was using the experience and techniques previously employed against South Korea's citizens to conduct psychological offensives against our own people. The experience and techniques that had been learned were replicated in psychological operations aimed at North Koreans, though, in other ways, we were still fighting a cultural war on 2 fronts. The work of Office 101 was never confined to a single genre or medium. It employed speeches, video, music, and other forms of cultural expression, all under the names of South Korean or foreign authors that could be used to infiltrate and influence the values of Koreans. In April 1998, for example, 4 months before the start of my work at UFD, Office 101, Section 1 newspapers produced an article that received praise from Kim Jong-il. The piece was written under an assumed outsider's name and declared our great leader Kim Il-sung to be the son of the world. The evidence in question was the sinking of the Titanic. The date on which the RMS Titanic sank, 15th of April 1912, also happens to be the date of Kim Il-sung's birth. Using this coincidence as a form of historical proof, Section 1 explained that, as the sun set in the west, it rose in the east. Such creations of the United Front Department were then published in the party newspaper, the Rodong Sinmun, or broadcast on television, which only shows state-run channels, as the works of foreign authors, journalists, and intellectuals. The North Korean people could never have imagined that all these apparently foreign works were produced by Office 101 in the very heart of their capital, Pyongyang. Isolated from the outside world, it's not surprising that they believe that the people of the world, including South Koreans, admired our country's strong leadership and many achievements. After Kim Il-sung's death in 1994, epic poetry became the chief vehicle of political propaganda, with the publication of a poem by Kim Man-young of the Writers' Union Central Committee. The work took the form of a prayer for the eternal life of Kim Il-sung. Kim Jong-il published that lengthy poem in the Rodong Sinmun and proclaimed Kim Man-young the most loyal worker in North Korea. Soon afterwards, the poetry of Shin Yong-gang was promoted by the military's propaganda department in order to demonstrate their loyalty to dear leader. Kim Jong-il declared Shin's works, along with those of Kim Man-young, to be people's literature, and the 2 poets were presented with imported cars and household appliances, as well as extravagantly decorated luxury apartments whose furnishings included sets of gold-plated cutlery. Within my department, a panic ensued. Although the UFD also employed poets, it had not been able to satisfy Kim Jong-il with a single epic poem, a serious omission that could potentially lead to an accusation of insufficient loyalty on the part of the United Front Department as a whole. It had become an increasingly worrying concern to my colleagues by the time I joined the department. The problem had been exacerbated by the type of personnel they employed. Due to the constraints of psychological warfare under which the UFD operated, operatives were highly trained in ideological persuasion, but had not invested much thought in the literary qualities of the work they produced. It was, perhaps, the tragic and inevitable consequence of making art anonymously, as Supervisor Park Chul has suggested, when he described not being able to publish his works in his own name. Moreover, UFD writers had to accommodate two lies unique to them in the writing process. They had to pretend to be South Koreans in their feelings of adoration for Kim Jong-il, and this had to be expressed in a fabricated South Korean way of writing. Although I was the youngest writer on board, at 27, the onus of rectifying this situation fell on me. When I was summoned to UFD headquarters to receive orders from First Deputy Director Im Tong-ok, I could hardly believe my own ears. Im Tong-ok was the highest authority in the UFD, and even the head of Office 101 could not meet him without being explicitly summoned. The UFD had several sections, and more offices under each section. Office 101, to which I belonged, was part of the policy-making section of the UFD. Between me and Im Tong-ok was the head of Division 19, then that of Section 5, as well as the other various heads of Office 101. To be summoned outside of this chain of command was a striking anomaly. The headquarters of the UFD lies in Jeonsung-dong of Morambong district in Pyongyang. The long three-story building, privy to the secrets of the history of the Workers' Party and our nation's history of espionage, looked even more imposing than Office 101. As if to hide its secrets from the world, the building faced north, away from the sunlight, and was covered in ivy. The Deputy Policy Director of Office 101 led me to the door of Director Im Tong-ok's office, on the first floor of the building. The wooden floorboards creaked beneath our feet with every step. The majestic old building seemed to be built in an old Russian style, with its high ceilings and large windows, and the imposing double doors to Director Im's office added to the sense of grandeur. My guide knocked and entered, revealing another open door. He mumbled something into the room, and a loud voice answered from within. "Ask him to come in! Come in!" said First Deputy Director Im Tong-ok. His title of First Deputy Director meant that he acted with the absolute authority of Kim Jong-il in one of the nation's key ministries. There were only 6 institutions considered important enough to be headed by a First Deputy Director. The Organization and Guidance Department, Kim Jong-il's executive chain of command, which sits above the Constitution and has unrestricted jurisdiction to intervene in any sphere, the Propaganda and Agitation Department, whose first deputy directorship was left vacant until 1998, after which Jung Ha-chul was appointed to the post by Kim Jong-il, the United Front Department, Office 38, in charge of Kim Jong-il's personal wealth, Office 35, conducts intelligence activities overseas, and the Ministry of State Security, the secret police. Director Im came to meet me at the door. His piercing gaze and countenance suggested that he indeed had authority over all matters related to South Korea and to the external presentation of North Korea as the representative of Kim Jong-il. However, perhaps he was dumbfounded by the situation he found himself in, assigning such a critical task to an inexperienced young man, or perhaps he was just at a loss for words. He wiped his wide forehead, mustered all the concern he could gather into his deep wrinkles, and made it clear, in his long-winded way, that this task was not one he was assigning lightly. Then he suddenly stood to attention, saying with utmost conviction, "Now the General's order will be communicated." Whenever Kim's words are disseminated in an order, letter, or certificate of appreciation, the speaker must stand to attention, and make sure his appearance is properly respectful, that his uniform is impeccable, and that all his shirt buttons are done up properly. Loyalty to Kim Jong-il had to be demonstrated even in the smallest action, as well as through one's overall attitude. As Director Im stood to attention, I instinctively did the same, waiting for his next words. "The General has issued an order for an epic poem to be used in the conducting of psychological warfare," he continued. "This work must promote the notion that our Songun policy has been formulated to protect South Korea. The United Front Department assigns this operation to Comrade Kim Kyung-min," he said, using my assumed South Korean name. Director Im looked as if he were about to continue speaking, but paused when he noticed that I was biting my lip in consternation. The Songun, or military first policy, was supposed to unify the entire Korean peninsula under Kim Jong-il through the superior might of our military force and to defend our socialism. I now had to write a poem based on the premise that such a policy protected the South. Without realizing it, I had grimaced at the evident impossibility of such a task. Director Im assumed a severe expression, but seemed to be at a loss for further words. "You have 2 months," he said, and the meeting was over. It was mid-December 1998. From that day on, I worked round the clock on the task that had been assigned to me. The basic argument was straightforward. It was my job to praise Kim Jong-il as the master of the gun, the bringer of justice, and the people's lord who knew only victory. But the essence of the task was to find evidence for these truths and shape them into a literary form. To help me accomplish this, I spent an entire month reading South Korean literature, identifying themes that supported the argument I was to expound. I decided on a comparison of South Korea's Mangwol-dong Memorial for the Martyrs of Democracy with North Korea's Sinmiri Memorial for Revolutionary Martyrs, with a pun linking Gukgun, the name of South Korea's national army, and Songun, the military first policy of North Korea. This allowed me to compare South and North as two sides of the same coin. While the democratic martyrs of South Korea had been killed by the bullets of their Gukgun, the revolutionary martyrs of North Korea would be looked after even in their afterlife by our policy of Songun. My poem portrayed South Korea's military as aggressive, and that of North Korea as concerned solely with defending the Korean people. When I submitted my proposal, Director Im and the other UFD officials heaped praise on the approach I had chosen. On 16th of May 1961, a military coup ended civilian rule in South Korea and ushered in the military dictatorship of Park Chung-hee. His long rule of 18 years was ended by his assassination by an associate, but in the instability that followed, Cheon Do-hwan positioned himself as the new military dictator. In this way, the divided peninsula was ruled by a military dictator not only in North Korea, but also in the South. On 18th of May 1980, however, South Korean democratic activists rose up in protest in the provincial city of Gwangju in South Korea. They were violently suppressed in the streets by South Korean soldiers, whose authoritarian leader claimed that the protesters, who were armed and were damaging government property and the police station, were North Korean agents who had infiltrated the country. Taking my inspirational starting point from the fact that the South Korean military had once massacred its own citizens, I wrote in the passionate voice of a South Korean poet visiting Pyongyang in May. To the poet, a Korean spring could not come about through nature's will alone. It could only be brought about and sustained by the committed protest of the people rising for their rights. The South Korean poet, knowing only a blood-soaked spring, recognizes in Pyongyang a true Korean spring. Here, both Koreas are protected by Kim Jong-il's policy of Songun, as he wields the very gun handed to him by his father, Kim Il-sung, who once used the weapon to free the Korean people from Japanese rule. This is how the poet concludes his praise of that gun. So this is the gun, that in the hands of an inferior man can only commit murder, but when wielded by a great man, can overcome anything. As history has shown, war and carnage belong to the weak. General Kim Jong-il, the general alone, is lord of the gun, lord of justice, lord of peace, lord of unification. Ah, the true leader of the Korean people. The poem was presented to Kim Jong-il in time for the anniversary of the Gwangju Uprising on 18th of May 1999. After publication, I received the moving news that Kim Jong-il had read my poem many times, underlining key phrases as he went. He even wrote next to the title of the poem in his own hand, "This is the artistic standard of the Songun era." It was a historic moment of triumph for the UFD in establishing itself above the military and the party's propaganda departments in the sphere of literary arts. Most importantly for me, I gained the personal approval of the single most powerful man in our country. The personal endorsement from Kim Jong-il was followed by an order for nationwide publication. 4 days after my submission of the poem, on 22nd of May 1999, Spring Rests on the Gun Barrel of the Lord was distributed throughout the nation in the Rodong Sinmun newspaper. This led to my invitation to become one of the admitted of Kim Jong-il. My entry into this circle changed the course of my life in the way that winning the lottery might do in a capitalist nation. My career ahead was full of opportunities from which I could cherry-pick as I chose. But most importantly, my new status guaranteed a privilege of immunity that was powerful beyond imagination. Not even the highest authorities of the DPRK could investigate, prosecute, or harm one of the admitted. The only way prosecution could possibly occur was for the crime to be treason, and for the Organization and Guidance Department to receive explicit permission from Kim Jong-il himself. Nobody wanted to push too far, and risk the ill will of the general himself, so such a process was rarely pursued. The party's Organization and Guidance Department, responsible for the protection of Kim Jong-il, operated a special section dedicated to serve those who were admitted. The criteria was strict and the circle small. As was the case with me, Kim Jong-il had personally to request your presence and spend time with you behind closed doors for more than 20 minutes. Bursting with pride at my admission to this tiny and exclusive elite, I felt like a new man each day. My first year of work at the UFD passed by very quickly. In North Korea, the anniversary on 8th of July of Kim Il-sung's death, referred to as the celebration of Kim Il-sung's eternal life, is a field of battle amongst cadres desperate to demonstrate their loyalty to the cult of Kim. Director Im Tong-ok announced during the UFD's agenda meeting for the year 2000 that we would be the ones to offer the best epic poem to Kim Jong-il, outshining the military and party's propaganda departments once again. As I was now one of the admitted, there was no question of the glorious task falling to anyone other than me, and my primary task for the year was the completion of this assignment. Director Im took the reins with great gusto from the start of the first thematic planning meeting. Quiet, please. We will now begin our meeting to discuss the literary work of the United Front Department that will be published to commemorate the Supreme Leader's immortal life on the 8th of July. I have already asked Comrade Kim Kyung-min to call his poem An Ode to the Smiling Sun. In any event, we must stick to the smiling sun motif. As Director Im said, the only way to eulogize the Supreme Leader's immortal life was through the motif of the smiling sun. The Workers' Party had conducted propaganda activities focused on Kim Il-sung and his successor Kim Jong-il for over half a century. In the context of this tradition, smiling sun was a relatively new motif. It had first been seen at the funeral of Kim Il-sung in 1994. Usually, funeral portraits showed the deceased wearing a somber expression. However, declaring that the Supreme Leader is alive and with us forever, Kim Jong-il ordered that the standard funeral portrait of his father be exchanged for one of him smiling. From then on, the Supreme Leader was referred to as a sun whose immortal life was a smile. On 8th of July 1997, exactly 3 years after Kim Il-sung's death, the Central Party Committee, Central Military Committee, National Defense Commission, Central People's Committee, and Parliamentary Committee issued a joint declaration that Kim Il-sung's birthday was to be inaugurated as the Sun Festival. At the same time, it was declared that our calendar was to be changed. Kim Il-sung's birthday, 15th of April 1912, was set as the first year of the new Juche calendar. Juche being the state-ratified philosophy of North Korea based on the principle of self-reliance. The year AD 2000 became Juche 89. Now, Comrade Kim Kyung-min will expound on this theme. Only after someone tapped me on the arm did I realize that everyone was waiting for me to rise and speak. I leapt to my feet. Although the title of this work refers to the smiling sun, I would like the poem to make a literary allusion to tears. I could hear murmuring around me. If you examine the Smiling Sun works produced until now by the party or military, they refer to the Supreme Leader's smile predominantly in the context of our achievements, I explained. For example, the Supreme Leader smiles from the height of his immortality because he is satisfied with the great virtue and legacy politics of our general's rule, or as he peers down with pleasure at our unique kind of socialism, which remains steadfast despite threats and pressure from imperialistic forces. In my view, it is time for the United Front Department to steer towards satisfying our audience's literary sensibilities and to move beyond agitating their political fervor. That's all very well, but how will you satisfy their literary sensibilities? Director Im asked curtly. This is what I propose to say. When I traced the history of the Smiling Sun, I discovered that our Supreme Leader was surrounded by tears from early childhood. Embarking on his life in this manner, the Supreme Leader triumphed over individual suffering and anguish and dedicated his entire life to his people and homeland by smiling. In other words, our Supreme Leader lived for his people and not for himself. This progression will lead to the following conclusion. All the tears that were to have been shed by his people, our Supreme Leader took on himself alone to shed. What smiles he had, he gave them all so that his people might smile. By juxtaposing his tears and his smiling, the Smiling Sun will appear to shine more brightly. This also allows for the Smiling Sun to be ascribed with the following poetic qualities. When the Supreme Leader gave the people his gift of smiling, it manifested as his love. When he sowed his gift on our lands, it manifested as rays of the sun, and as he left his gift for history, it manifested as immortal life. As soon as I finished speaking, Director Im leapt out of his chair. His excitement could not be contained, and he smacked the desk several times. He exclaimed, "That's it! If this goes according to plan, the General will no doubt be moved to tears, as will the rest of the nation. The Propaganda and Agitation Department and the General Political Bureau are no match for us. Let me assure you, the United Front Department will come out ahead if we go through with this. This is real poetry. Comrades, what are your thoughts?" With the powerful head of the United Front Department showing such enthusiasm for my proposal, it was no wonder that praise and wonder erupted from the rest of the room, too. One man confessed how difficult it had been for him to hold back tears as he listened to me speak, and began to clap his hands. Suddenly, Supervisor Park Chul stood up, wearing a severe expression in stark contrast to the others in the room. He was my immediate superior, as the head of Office 101, Section 5. "Comrade Director Im," he said, "although the proposal is laudable in its literary potential, I believe that a reference to our Supreme Leader shedding tears is highly problematic." The room was silent. Supervisor Park Chul continued. "Kim Chul, one of our nation's 3 canonical poets, employed the word due to refer euphemistically to the leader's tears. For this mistake he was banished to the countryside for 10 years. "What do you mean? Of course we can make reference to tears. Don't you remember how our general shed tears at our Supreme Leader's funeral ceremony? And it was even broadcast all over the world. On top of that, I'm sure I've seen references to our Supreme Leader's tears when he was moved by the novels he read." As Director Im retorted with annoyance, other cadres nodded enthusiastically. Park Chul spoke again. "The novel is a descriptive genre, but poetry is a lyric genre. Poetry is to do with human emotions, not with human psychology. To refer so explicitly to tears in a poem would promote pessimism on the part of the individual. Besides, in verse, you can only have tears of loyalty. Yet Comrade Kyung-min proposes not only to refer to the tears of an individual, but of our Supreme Leader himself. Heaven forbid! If we are accused of promoting pessimism on the part of our Supreme Leader, each one of us will have to face the consequences." No one said a word, perhaps at the terrifying mention of consequences. One man shut his notepad, as if to acknowledge that the meeting was over. I rose again to speak. "Of course you are right to say that tears of loyalty, which must be shed by an individual, are the only tears permitted in poetry. But the poetic work in discussion here is to be composed in the genre of epic. Epic poetry is a narrative genre, just like the novel. Moreover, the focus of the work is not on our Supreme Leader shedding tears, but on how he has continuously exercised restraint and held them back. It is due to this forbearance that his tears were made manifest as love, sunshine, and immortal life. Therefore I do not see a problem. Supervisor Park, visibly annoyed that an employee of his should speak out in defiance, refused to change his stance. Referring to our Supreme Leader's tears once or twice. There's nothing wrong with that. But you're talking about an epic poem, whose length will require repeated references to our Supreme Leader's tears. Have you ever seen such a thing in any of our nation's poems? Right now, as our nation pulls through this time of famine and bad harvests, the party slogan is, "The journey is hard, but let us go forth in laughter." And you propose to write a poem about our Supreme Leader shedding tears? At these words, even the cadre, who had earlier been close to tears upon hearing my proposal, nodded in agreement. Everyone now looked to Director Im. Pushing at the table with both hands, he stood up and spoke gravely. This is the plan. Starting from today, Comrade Kyung-min will put all other duties aside for 6 months and compose an epic poem according to his proposal. But he will make sure to avoid excessive reference to our Supreme Leader's tears. At the United Front Department, you have assumed a South Korean identity, and this allows you some leeway. We're not restricted by writers' union rules, and don't have to go through their censorship or approval process. We just have to judge among ourselves at the UFD as best we can. The current proposal is excellent in terms of its literary merit. Let's make this work. Director Im dismissed everyone from the meeting, but asked me to stay behind. The two of us were alone in the room. Don't pay any attention to what Supervisor Park says, he told me. I'm sure he's jealous. What achievements can he boast of? You have 6 months of hard work ahead of you. You should take a week off. Go and recharge yourself. Where would you like to go? I told him I wanted to visit my hometown. After meeting the General, I had been thinking a lot about my friends back home. It was glorious enough to have been admitted to the UFD, but I had even become one of the admitted. How much everyone would admire me. I said that revisiting my place of birth would help me equip myself emotionally for the task ahead. Im Tong-ok granted my request without hesitation.